Okay, we'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of APCHA for Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. Apologies for late start. We had some technical difficulties. First item on the agenda here is a roll call vote.
Okay. Francie? There's an iPhone. Is it Ward?
I don't believe Ward will be attending tonight.
Okay. John Ward.
Present.
Carson.
Here.
Kelly. Here. John Doyle.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, we will see. I don't have any agenda amendments, so we will move to public comment. Is there anybody that would like to make public comment, either in the room or online? If you're online, you'd like to make public comment, just please unmute yourself. And not seeing any public comment, so we will move forward to Board of Directors comments, and we'll start online with Francie. John.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that Ward, Howenstein, and I did have an APCHA discussion at council this week, and in order to inform the other members of our council, and it was well received. Thanks.
Kelly.
I don't have any comments tonight, thank you.
John.
I don't have specific comments tonight, no.
Okay. I just had a few things just as a follow-up to the City Council meeting. So City Council has said they're interested in researching legality and possibility of incentivizing right-sizing. So I think that there's some legal questions surrounding that, so we may have an agenda item on that in the future. Another thing I heard support for at City Council was business ownership of APCHA units. So I don't know, I mean, it may be worth the board talking about that to see if there's a way we can support that. I know that's certainly something that that I would be interested in supporting. Let's see.
What, sorry to,
Yeah.
is that,
So it was either, I think Ward's comments were around if there's rental housing, maybe there's a way to allow owners to pay into, I think his words were some kind of a kitty where basically business owners could pay in and then sort of control tenants in exchange for that. So I thought that was a creative idea. So I think something worth talking about. Couple other things. So annual work plan. I've asked for a work session on that for the board to just be more involved in coming up with our annual work plan. So that'll be on a future agenda. I mentioned the IGA at the last meeting. Unless there's an objection to that, I'd like to add that to a future agenda as well. And that's all my comments. So, anything, Kelly?
I just want to understand what your goal would be with a conversation about the IGA.
I mean, I think it needs to be changed.
Oh.
So, I don't think that, it's currently being effective, and I might have more comments on that later.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Matthew.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Yep, I've got work plan and strategic plan. We'll get that on the agenda in June. We've extended an offer for the HOA coordinator, community outreach person. I think we're very close to getting that finalized. And we had a good discussion on tax transcripts with a company on Friday, and they're getting back to us. They're checking with IRS on a few things, and they're going to be getting back to us very soon. I'm just going to read this. This is from Andrew. ReCAPTCHA is in the process of being removed from the HomeTrack website. Testing has been done in our sandbox environment to make sure that the removal did not affect the use of the system in other areas. Testing was signed off on as 5/14/2024, and Hexaware will be working on migrating the removal of ReCAPTCHA to our production environment as soon as possible. So we're working on that. And then we did get, I hope you all got the email that was sent to the APCHA board with some feedback on the right-sizing program. So
I did. I did not have a chance to respond
That's
to
fine.
that, but I did have a question on that. I don't know if I just misunderstood. Did
there were a
you-
couple things we,
I mean, I
well, in
felt
fact-
like the recommendation was
yeah, that's,
already allowed.
you mean
right.
right side.
I felt like that email was more directed towards, allow me to count my IVF child as a child.
Yeah,
Well,
Really, wasn't that what that
there was a lot of, it's a
no,
long email.
It was saying,
Yeah, that's there, and then
I think the recommendation was to allow a couple with one child to bid on a 3-bedroom, which
They can.
They can do.
No. What I
Right?
took
Or did
away
I
from that was a separate recommendation related to giving more weight towards maximum house size. So filling every bedroom in a unit over the income guidelines for that unit. So one of the suggestions that had been made was, hey, we could have put 3 people into this
Right.
3-bedroom unit if you had allowed our income category to apply for this unit, but because they're capped at whatever unit it's assigned, it went to people with only 2 bedrooms in a 3-bedroom unit. So that was its own discrete recommendation, which I do think falls into some of our interests in talking about how we reassign unit categories, but I took that as being a little bit discrete from the right sizing process.
But we'll,
And Kelly, just to clarify,
Yeah.
none of the units that went through lottery were actually given to someone below occupancy.
Right.
So we're not entirely sure what 2 units he is speaking of, to be specific. They could have been at Aspen Village or, with not a occupancy requirement associated.
Or maybe like if something went to the 5th person in the lottery.
But they all went to occupancy, full occupancy, as far as we know. So,
but we will, I think, I just want to check that everybody got the email and we got it, and there's some good feedback in there, and we'll have a look at that when we start looking at right sizing again. P for a hearing officer, if you guys have discussed that before, we didn't feel like there was clarity to actually go ahead and do it, but it's ready to go if the board would like it to go ahead, or if you'd like to have further discussion. So I'm putting that back for some direction from you guys.
I think we should have an agenda item for, I think we should get one. But I think we should have an agenda item for a discussion before
To
we
talk
send it
about
out.
the RFP.
I'll support that.
Okay,
Do you want the RFP in the packet to look at?
let's do that.
Okay, great.
Unless Tom has. any
No,
other-
I was agreeing that if you're gonna make a decision, it should be an agenda.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. And that's all I have this evening. Thank you.
Cindy?
All right, we will be advertising a 1 or a 2-bedroom category 4 at Centennial, beginning, I believe, it'll go out live on Friday. We have a couple right now that they actually, if you have a new bid or whatever, it was due today by 4 o'clock. Otherwise, if you are all updated in your packet and everything, it closes on 5/22. You can check what that is on, it's another Centennial, I believe. I believe we also will be having 2 rentals that we'll be advertising after 5 o'clock on Friday. One is an RO studio and one is a T2 studio. So just make sure you sign up for notifications on our website. Thank you.
Okay. Just one item on the consent agenda, minutes of May 1st. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? Hearing none, it's a roll call vote.
John Ward,
Aye.
Carson,
Yes.
Kelly,
Yes.
John Doyle.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll move now to discussion on compliance enforcement. So I added this. I added this just to discuss how compliance enforcement is handled in general. Over the last couple of months, I've attempted to resolve an issue before bringing it to the board, but have not been successful. And so by the end of this conversation, I'd like for the board to be clear on its stance. I've got a few questions. Number one, what are the expectations of the board when it comes to enforcement of the regulations it writes? Is it possible for the board to ensure policy is enforced as written under the current IGA? Are there situations where well-documented violations should be closed without enforcement? And how can we better define the lanes of what the board is accountable for and what happens when there is crossover, i.e. policy and enforcement? So no doubt there's probably questions on where this is all coming from. So I've kind of written it down just so that I make sure I get all my thoughts out accurately. So if I boil all this down to kind of where it started, this item is on the agenda because the report of concern function hasn't worked for at least 7 months. We heard tonight it should be fixed this week. This in and of itself seems like a small issue not worthy of the board's time, and I agree. What's driving all this is because people couldn't make complaints online and because my email's in the paper once a month, people started emailing me. And so I started getting complaints, multiple complaints. And, prior to getting a lot of these complaints, I was under the impression that APCHA was enforcing compliance in accordance with written policy. And that does not appear to be the case, as I'm going to outline now. So I received a complaint from someone who was unable to report online in March asking why APCHA had refused enforcement on a complaint made in September of 2023 and alleging 2 additional violations in 2024. The complaint I received alleged at least 3 instances of a failure to obtain approval from APCHA to rent a deed-restricted property, charging more than a max allowed rent and not qualifying a tenant. One of the allegations was supported by a lease, copies of paid checks, and text messages to corroborate their accusation. APCHA closed this case in 2023 with no fine and no additional enforcement after the owner claimed ignorance of the deed restriction and promised not to break the rules again. The tenant had asked for APCHA to return their overpaid rent, which APCHA has very little authority over because APCHA has a contract, the deed restriction, with the owner of the property and not the tenant. As some of you are aware, sometimes overpaid rent is returned in court cases or through settlements or to avoid the sale of a property. And sometimes not, but APCHA has no authority to explicitly require excess rent to be repaid. APCHA can only enact enforcement against the property owner. I forwarded the complaint to staff on March 21st, and about a month later got a follow-up complaint which included the tenant's phone number. I put staff in contact with the tenant, whose staff had already spoken with in September of 2023 on April 23rd of this year. Because as a member of this board, I wanted out of the middle of compliance, and I shouldn't even be involved with complaints. I requested, to be removed from the complaint. Staff emailed me on 4/26 to let me know that they spoke to the tenant and that they were closing the second case after also speaking to the property owner, who denied having additional tenants. The facts of this individual case and the refusal to begin enforcement is one I disagree with, but I have no authority to change enforcement as a member of this board. And if that were the end of it, we wouldn't be talking about compliance tonight. More concerning than the individual case was the response to my disagreement with the decision. The response I received was that this type of enforcement was, quote, consistent with the publicly articulated compliance ethos of using tools to bring people into compliance rather than using tools punitively, end quote. How somebody who is well documented in violating the regulations can return to compliance just by promising not to do it again is a concept I don't understand and is not supported in the regulations or historical precedent. The fine schedule is meant to be less punitive than forcing the sale of the property, which is why I added fines, or why the board added fines to the regulations in the first place. So, not everybody on the board has been on the board as long as John Ward. So I've got some history on rental compliance cases. June 21st, 2018, Aspen Times headline, former APCHA board member to sell her home after renting it out. The property was rented 10 times in 2016 and 17. She was unable to work due to a car accident, and the APCHA board voted 6-1 to force the sale of the home. John Ward was the lone dissenting vote, and his dissent was due to the upcoming fine schedule that was being discussed. I was an alternate and didn't vote. January 28th, 2019, Aspen Times. Aspen Housing Board forces 2 residents to sell their units for non-compliance. An owner had to move out of town for a double lung transplant and was forced to sell his home after listing it on Craigslist. I was involved in that vote, and it was one of the hardest decisions that I've ever been a part of, and I left that meeting feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. But I made the hard decision because Tom Smith frequently reminds us the rules apply to everyone or they apply to no one. November 20th, 2019, the fine schedule is implemented. October 8th, 2020, Aspen Times, local woman fined $5,000 for renting a room in Woody Creek Affordable Housing Unit. The Woody Creek owner was fined $5,000 for renting a room in her house on Airbnb. Historically, renting out a unit without APCHA approval or above maximum rates was a major violation that resulted in the sale of the property. I believe this is still a major violation. The fine schedule gave APCHA staff the ability to avoid using forced sale as its only tool when enforcing compliance. In my 7 years on this board and its previous iteration, never was it discussed in my presence that APCHA would allow owner violations of this nature to come back into compliance by simply promising not to break the rules again. I've also not heard this discussed with Aspen City Council or BOCC, so I'm not sure how this is consistent with the publicly articulated compliance ethos of APCHA, especially when in response to a case of this nature. So when in a course of dealings, something is consistent, it becomes policy. And the message of this unapproved new policy is break the rules until you get caught, keep the profit, and face no consequences as long as you promise not to do it again. This isn't a position that I can or will defend in this community, whether I'm a member of this board or not. This board has gone to great lengths to combat the rumors within the community that APCHA gets complaints and takes no action, which appear to be fact rather than fiction from what I have seen. There are potentially severe consequences for this new policy, and I've made my objections to this unapproved new policy and the potential consequences well known to staff and the city manager's office with both urgency and frequency. As the board chair, I feel my warnings have been repeatedly brushed off. You've all heard me talk about transparency before, so here we are. I met with the city manager on May 7th and posed the following questions, among others. Who instituted this policy and when? And why was something of this magnitude never discussed with the APCHA board? I still haven't received answers to those questions, but only people in this room could have enacted this policy, and it wasn't the APCHA board. I'd like to ask our representative of city council to see if he can get an answer if we can't get one tonight. I was also asked by the city manager during this meeting if I expected criminal charges to be pressed, which is particularly surprising as everyone on this board knows that APCHA uses civil law and not criminal law to enforce deed restrictions. As a member of this board, we are policy focused and should not be involved in managing the administrative details of staff under the current IGA. However, when an issue of this magnitude impacts enforcement of policy that we write and are accountable, it becomes within the purview of this board. These issues are not surprising and are even predictable given the current structure of the IGA. I don't feel any of this is the fault of the individuals involved. I sincerely believe every person on APCHA staff is acting with good intentions and self-preservation. This is simply the position that the current IGA puts all of us in with its structure. The current IGA gives this board the authority to set policy and enforce policy through the courts, but gives all authority to manage everything in between to the city manager. This creates a system where no one is really in charge and ensures this board is really more of an advisory board. When everyone is responsible for something, no one is accountable for anything, and such is the case here. I've spent way too much time and effort trying to get existing policy enforced, which shouldn't even need discussion, but I have zero authority as the board chair. Another area where I have no control is the IGA. What I can control is making sure the changes of this significance aren't made again without public board discussion, which is what we're here to talk about. So I'll close by saying that if this compliance case I've been referencing were to ever come before this board, I've been involved at this point so much that I'm going to have to recuse myself. And so for that reason, I don't think the board should discuss this particular case or any of the merits tonight. Though I'm hopeful that staff will open a third case on this complaint. I would like for the board to discuss the expectations for compliance enforcement and application of the existing written policy. If what I've found is actually APCHA's new enforcement policy, the public deserves to hear the merits debated as would be required for any new policy. So with that, I'll open debate to the board and I'll restate my questions to get us going. So what are the expectations of this board when it comes to enforcement of the regulations it writes? How can the board ensure policy is enforced as written under the current IGA? Are there situations where well-documented violation and subsequent alleged repeat violations should be allowed to stand with no consequence? And can we, as the board, better define lanes of what the board is accountable for and what happens when there is crossover? So with that, I'll open it up.
Well, I mean, and you talked about it, I can remember that case clearly. You know, somebody rented out her room, I think, and used it to pay her HOA dues, paid her mortgage because she couldn't work, right?
Right.
I had a hard time voting yes on that, but the reason for the fine schedule, to me, gave us tools to go, all right, so we're not gonna kick you out, but you either divulge the income or something. And if we don't enforce that, I mean, my expectation is the rules are enforced fairly and equally across the spectrum of our units. Now, I know there's deed restrictions that have different rules because it's such an old program, but we have rules and regulations, otherwise we have nothing.
Okay, this is a lot. This is big.
It's a lot.
And I'm wondering, I'm honing in on your statement about really giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. That's where I always come from. We're all,
Yeah.
I believe in good actors, and I think that I assume good intent always.
Complete.
And I'm wondering, did the staff have the benefit of this statement that you just read by any chance? Because there's a lot in it.
No, I wrote it just now, but if there's any dispute or, I mean, I welcome anybody that would like to dispute anything that I've said.
Well, I would encourage you to share it so that
Sure, I'm happy to do
they
that.
can read and reflect upon it. I don't think we'll achieve any resolution tonight because there's a lot to dig into here. And I appreciate you raising your concerns because I have
Yeah,
good faith in all of your many years of service.
and what I will say is, I mean, I've attempted to resolve this many times. And like I say, I mean, the response I got was that this is consistent with how we're doing
Sure.
enforcement.
Well, and this leads me to another question, because what we have in our packet is super helpful, and it points directly to the regulations that we have adopted as a board. I do expect that, you have to administer those regulations, so I'm curious if staff has written operations policies related to this that would help fill in some of the story for the board. And if so, it would be helpful for us to review those. Because I think, the role I really see for us here is making sure that the interpretations in execution line up with what we have stated in regulation or what we intended during our deliberations adopting those regulations, and that if there is misconception, lack of clarity, that is our opportunity to be really solid on that and maybe take corrective action so that moving forward there is clearer understanding between what we expect between staff and how staff has been guided to interpret these regulations. So I would pose that for Matthew, that if those do exist, it would be helpful for us to, I think, fill in a clearer picture here, to understand where you have said that there is a different policy or a new policy on, on compliance. I mean, I read here that, the APCHA has discretion to do one or more things when a notice of violation is issued. If we need to give clear guidance about what our expectations are on whether to do one or more and more, then maybe that's a helpful place to be productive here. So that's some of my initial ways to keep this dialogue going in a productive manner. And related to I have a lot of concerns about the compliance case that you have raised relative to our consistency for how similar cases have been treated in the past. And, I don't know the details of that. I would look to Tom to advise us perhaps in exec session on details of of that specific violation. To understand what options that there may be. But I would support that conversation happening too.
Okay.
Well, I'm concerned, I learned a new word tonight, thank you, Carson, ethos. But I'm concerned that ethos, that thought is, that we're gonna let somebody come back into compliance, almost a kindler, gentler APCHA kind of thing. We've taken hard lines. Had to take hard lines because of a board. We've heard some really effective sob stories along the way about losing my housing, whatever else. And that's a lot of the reason why we came up with a fine schedule, so we could give somebody a second chance without kicking them out of their unit. But I guess the ethos wasn't for anybody to walk away scot-free, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, these issues are all very concerning, and I think they should be looked into. It's not a good look for APCHA, especially at this time.
Agreed. Francie?
Yes, I would say that, Carson, you bring up a lot of good points, and I think the biggest danger of proceeding in this manner without consistent enforcement is people's loss of faith in APCHA. And I can tell just from the way the stories that you told that these have been really heartrending decisions to make, and I can understand that. So I appreciate the fact that we have some alternatives, and I agree with John that no enforcement, just saying, well, get your act together, is a questionable response to these type of violations.
Can I jump in some
Yes,
more?
go ahead.
I would like to see if Matthew would like to respond to any of this, but I'm hearing one specific example that maybe is causing a lot of angst for us, so I want to be cautious about drawing conclusions relative to the enforcement and compliance efforts by our staff, because I think for the most part, I've been of the impression that we've been really satisfied with them, and barring frustration with the online complaint system and getting the compliance report, on the website front and center. I don't want to ignore those requests for the board that have taken a while to resolve. So if we need to audit that as a board, maybe I just want to see what we need to know to understand if we think that this is like a systemic problem, or if we think that this is a one-off case. I don't exactly know how to offer to do that right now, but I do want to be hesitant about drawing conclusions about the entire enforcement program and conclusions about whether the IGA is insufficient because of our frustrations with what seems to be an obvious and significant violation.
Well, and based upon the stuff we see here, right, the appeals we get, the stuff we're dealing with, you would feel like maybe this is a one-off, I don't know, because we've got some tough decisions and we've had to hand out, or somebody has handed down, a hearing officer's handed down some really hard choices. And we've heard appeals on that. So you hope this is an isolated incident, but, you know, one, is there two, is there three? That's what you worry about. And that's where the trust needs to come into effect.
Well, and if somebody, obviously other people see non-compliance and they're like, I could get away with that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Matthew, Sarah, anything you?
I absolutely welcome this conversation, and I look forward to a further exploration with the board on their intentions. It's our intention to exercise the board's wishes in this regard, so look forward to more discussion. From staff's point of view, I believe since Jackie came online, we've in fact issued more notice of a violation in the past year than ever before, over 40.
No, 160.
Excuse me,
160.
160 notice of
That
violations.
was only a quarter.
160 in the past year.
More, closer to 180.
I keep getting the number wrong, it keeps going up, so it's 180 in the past year. So I think from that point of view, we're doing more compliance than ever before. If the board would like to walk through the process with us and for us to pay more attention to the fine, we can absolutely do that, and I look forward to that. We were planning with Jackie and Tom exploring how to use those fines in accordance with the board's wishes. Apparently we have not been doing that, and I look forward to that discussion, and we can get that on the agenda to walk through these regulations and get some if-then scenarios. And, you know, I look forward to doing whatever the board's wishes in this regard. But I think we have been having much more compliance in the past year since Jackie came on than ever before. And if you'd like that to be adjusted to a different direction with more emphasis on the fines, we can absolutely do that.
Sarah?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for an opportunity to speak with you tonight. For the record, Sarah Ott, City Manager of Aspen. A couple of things. So, as Carson alluded to, he and I met about a week ago on the 7th. And we covered a number of items in that conversation. And so there's a couple things I've done as follow-up since then, just to bring to the board's attention. First is I'm having a third-party audit of the case that seems to be the pain point for the chair. And that process is already underway. What I need from this board, though, for me to adequately direct this staff is clarity about how you want the fine schedule used. Is it used in every case, or is there no discretion for the staff, or what do you see as those reasonable boundaries of discretion? And that's really the most important conversation I think we need to have here. Should this have jumped immediately to a stage 4 fine? I think you have different opinions at the table about that, to be honest. And I would welcome that conversation about if your intentions with the fine schedule is that it is the first course
Well, let's
of
address that really quick,
compliance.
because you got a case like this where somebody essentially rented their unit for more than was allowed, correct? Right, rented a bedroom, rented their house, whatever it was. Now, they didn't qualify their tenant, right, so they didn't go to APCHA and go, Cindy, I'm gonna rent a room, rent my house to so-and-so. So let's say they assume they qualified as an employee of Pitkin County, whatever it is, to rent a room. Now, rent the room for $1,000 a night, or not a night, but a month or something. Maybe that's what qualifies based upon that category. So they rented for $2,500 or some number. Now you're $1,500 in the positive, right? You're over and above what you can rent it for. To me, the first step is like, well, you need to divulge that gain, that $1,500. You're in violation. You did it for 12 months. It's X dollars. I need to see that. Our fine might have been $5,000 or something for it. I don't know what it was. I don't remember what we set it up for. But the first thing, divulge your money, divulge it. We don't want to kick you out, but you violated the program. You made more than you should have. The city has pursued people, customers of mine, on renting deed-restricted units in buildings they own for more than they were allowed. The city wins, right? And they've had to write checks. To me, that's how you handle all of it. And clean it up. If they refuse to do that, nope, it's just like any other case we have. We go to the mat at some point.
So this is, again, why I think it's to have a great conversation about, as a board, as a productive conversation, so that I can provide better direction on how discretion is used or not used by the enforcement process with the staff. Because I'm hearing different levels of expectation, even in tonight's conversation, about wanting to bring people into compliance. And should there be a punitive component to that? At what level is the tipping point? And if the board would like to direct that, we're happy to take that direction. And I think that would be valuable for all of us if the staff is not meeting your expectations.
Sarah, we spent a lot of time in this room, in the other room, talking about fines. A lot of time. I mean, it seemed a year almost. And I don't think it ever came up that we weren't going to enforce the fines at some point.
So, John, but what I'm telling you is right, there's a situation here where you feel like that has not been handled properly. I've started an audit on the specific case in reference.
Sure.
I've been responsive to the board, what was represented to me as a concern of the entire board, and moving that specific process forward. I'm asking you for clarity so I can properly direct the staff right now.
And
I
I said,
don't
I don't know where the confusion
Well,
is.
can I intervene? I mean, is that okay?
Of course.
Thank you. In my comments, I had requested that if there was operational procedures that the staff is following to interpret the regulations, it would be helpful for us to know or review those. I don't think it would hurt for us to see what that gap looks like, because there's clearly a gap, whether we think we created it and how we wrote the regulations or how they're being read. I think that's a productive space for us to understand from staff, perhaps walking us through some of the notice of violations that they have executed in the last year to see if our interpretations line up.
Sure.
And perhaps identify a little more clarity maybe where they don't.
Can I make a quick statement? So in the notice of violations, as long as the deed restriction allows, we state what the fine would be. That fine is not final unless the hearing officer deems it final. So if it's either resolved in that time period or it doesn't go to a hearing officer, that fine is not final, and I am not collecting on it. So that might lead to your, idea of, is someone, are we slapping the fine on regardless of the situation and whether they end up not being in compliance, or is the fine only when it gets to the hearing officer? And the hearing officer determines that the individual is out of compliance.
Well, and if I remember correctly, I don't know if we wrote this for all of the violations, but some of them were, if not resolved within 30 days, you move into the second tier. If not resolved within the next 30 days, you move into the third tier. Like, they escalate.
They escalate. It's not tied to a time.
Not all of them
No,
escalate.
but they do escalate. It's not tied to a time, though.
And that's a great example of the clarity that could come from the board. That you work with someone for so long before a fine becomes mandatory, even before a hearing officer review. Those are things that would be helpful for us to, effectuate your policy within the ways you want it done.
Carson, could I make a couple of comments?
Of course.
I'm walking a tightrope here between legal advice and policy issues you're discussing. There's an overlap. It's a gray area. You think I'm out of line, you can tell me that. First, it's really not appropriate to discuss a specific case in this context. Carson has acknowledged that, and you've gotten a few facts about a specific case that give you concern, but you don't have the whole case. So I need to caution you about making a policy decision based on one case, especially when you don't have all the facts of that case. Second, in the end, we're dealing with a balancing the competing policies of enforcement discretion and selective enforcement. And there is no bright line to draw between the two when you make a decision to enforce or not enforce. I think it's absolutely crucial that staff and the board have an understanding, as Sarah's suggesting, about enforcement policy. But I think you need to be aware that you can't come up with a perfect policy. There is always going to be enforcement discretion by anyone who enforces the law. Traffic cop pulls you over, I'm only going to give you a warning this time. The next guy he pulls over, I'm sorry, this time I'm giving you a ticket. Now, you can't, the guy who gets the ticket can't go to court and say, the other guy got off, I should get off. Why? Because there's such a thing as enforcement discretion. Enforcement discretion turns on the facts of every case, and every case, while they may have commonalities, every case is going to be different. So you're not going to be able to come up with a policy, I don't think, that it satisfies you in terms of having absolute certainty about how the fine are going to be imposed. I think if you were to look at all the enforcement cases after they've been closed, where fines have been, as Bethany has said, there's always in there in the notice, you may have to pay a fine. Well, from staff to the hearing officer, every case is different in terms of how they get finally resolved. I can guarantee you that there are cases where there has been found to be a violation beside this one, which I don't know the facts of, don't get me wrong, but there are going to be other cases that you would find where there wasn't a fine. And that's because of the circumstances that are particular to the case. And they can involve issues of intent, it can involve issues of the practical effect of the violation, the severity of the violation, past history of the owner or landlord or tenant. There are all kinds of things that go into consideration when you enforce and when you impose a fine or when you tell somebody they got to sell their unit. So I'm just trying to give you a word of caution and let you know that there's no silver bullet here that's going to satisfy you that in every case you know what's going to happen because you have set up this fine system. Again, you need to have an understanding with staff and trust one another that there is enforcement discretion is being properly exercised.
Well, and I think we do.
Okay.
But I also think there are certain cases, try not to be specific with this one, but where money exchanges hands, and somebody benefited monetarily by violating a policy, that there's only one way out, right? You either get a fine.
I don't know I don't know
I'm just
anything
saying, there's
besides what
certain
you
cases,
just
and
said.
there
Yeah.
can be gray area, there can be,
Yeah.
you know, a director should have some kind of input, right? They're a leader in the organization, you trust them to make good decisions. But there's certain cases where there absolutely should be some kind of, it's just gonna happen. Whether you come in compliance because you didn't get your affidavit signed within a window of time. I know that was a fine you could have gotten, right? Somebody didn't do their affidavits in a period of time, you could have got a fine. That is pretty small, and then they get bigger. The violations get bigger.
You know, the big concern that I had with this was that this was publicly articulated, and I don't recall ever hearing any discussion on changing, and which is, you know, perhaps that's the mistake that I made is having been on the board, I sort of expected housing enforcement to continue with the way that it's been unless there is a change. And if there is a change, I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that the board would discuss that change.
When you're putting stuff in the paper that is, you know, backing up APCHA, right?
I am. I mean, you know, it's like I wrote
complying.
a column on March 21st, and you know, I mean, I feel like there are things within that column that I need to now go back and correct just based on this. Now, obviously, that's not a rash decision, but you know, I have a name and a reputation to protect, and if I feel like I've written something in the paper which is not true, I feel like I need to correct that. So, again, all of this tonight, I did not want to bring this to the board meeting. I attempted to resolve this behind the scenes, and I feel like I was stonewalled, and this was my only option. So that's why we're talking about it tonight. Diane.
No, turned it off, sorry. If I may, just one piece of information that may be helpful in creating a little bit more understanding about, as Kelly pointed out, the, how it works. And that is, you know, you heard from staff, right? 180 notice of violations have been issued since Jackie's joined, which is less than a year, I think? A little over a year. So in that notice of, so your fine schedule shows up in every one of those notice of violations. It specifically states, this is what your notice of violation is about. From the fine schedule, here's this piece. What happens next, and I don't believe actually there's been any change to how it works, with the exception of the board directed during COVID, do not enforce, right? There was a moratorium by the board during COVID. So with the exception of that, is my understanding there's not been a change. Importantly, what happens next, though, is that your regulations at the top of page 55 allow people to cure. If they come into compliance, they don't have to pay the fine. If you want them, John, what you just described very articulately, if you want that to happen, that if they are found to be in violation, and they just have to pay the fine, then you have to change your regulations.
Well, but I know,
Can I make a comment
100%
on
know,
that?
we talked about that specific scenario in these discussions. And I honestly, I thought it was probably already incorporated, so.
Can I make a comment on that, just to clarify what
Tom.
Diane said? The opportunity to cure is not automatic. Okay, it is not, it is stated as an option for among various other enforcement options. And the reason that it's an option is that there can be circumstances, oh, by the way, I should say, the old deed restrictions, which is where that came from, before the generation of deed restrictions that we've had in the last 10 years, all the old deed restrictions absolutely gave every owner an opportunity to cure. And yet, what we were finding was that, well, wait a minute, not all violations really can be cured. Once they've happened, okay? If you've run the red light, it's over. You've run the red light. You can't back up and say, oh, I won't do it again. So, I mean, that's a very poor analogy, but my point is that we now have in the rules that opportunity to cure is something that staff can give a violator, but they don't have to give it. Same thing with sale. You can say, well, the deed restriction, and all our deed restrictions say, if you violate, even for the smallest violation, you gotta sell. Well, we went to the fine schedule. That's an alternative. So all these things are various alternatives. There's no absolute opportunity to cure, but staff, it's a discretionary option. It's in there that they can give the person an opportunity to cure if the circumstances warrant it. Okay, just to be clear.
No, that's helpful.
Just one quick point of clarification. So you mentioned COVID, and we did discuss, the board did discuss compliance cases regarding COVID, but that was specific to not working. That certainly did not apply, obviously, to all regulations.
And you're absolutely correct. And there was enforcement then. And John, right, you may have talked about it prior to the March 2020. It just didn't, that discretion given about the ability to cure is in there. And that's the only point I wanted to make, is that you can change these regulations. You absolutely can. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think this is making a really strong argument for why the IGA needs to be changed. We just heard from Tom that there is no way that we can write the regulations to perfectly execute the board's wishes in every instance. And so what we're being told, what is being told to us tonight is you wrote the regulations, somebody at some point decided that they were going to change the way that enforcement had been done historically, and the board was not, nobody talked to the board about it. And I just have a fundamental problem with that. I mean, it sort of makes me wonder, well, I'll just stop there.
I think my personal takeaways are a little bit different. You know, again, I think that staff has been operating within bounds that they thought were reasonable and adherent to the regulations that we adopted, even if there is disagreement about how closely that they're adhering. I think that the missed opportunity here is perhaps better consult between staff and the board about some of these cases related to, you know, I mean, I think we sit in exec all the time related to perhaps lawsuits and things like that. There's no reason why we can't be consulted more frequently or directly on compliance cases to give direction.
Well,
So,
there is a problem,
Yeah.
because you hear appeals.
oh, that is true. Yeah, so maybe that is the problem that needs to be resolved, because we can't give,
No appeals.
you know, we can't help with the interpretation.
Actually, you could delegate that to the hearing officer, but then
It's the same
the
guy hearing it,
downside of
right?
that is if the hearing officer is making decisions that you don't like, you don't get a chance to check in and
No,
decide.
I believe in the appeals process.
This was
because
something we debated when the rules were under revision.
It's a little
Yeah.
bit of by your peers type of deal.
So, I think there's a lot of productive paths forward. I think our compliance program is as strong as it's ever been. I will say, you know, I'm also sensitive to us giving clear expectations about what we would like to see, and recognize that, you know, we have competing values in our strategic plan about, you know, being empathetic and being compliant. So there is tension here that I think we need to better resolve and give greater clarity around. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that by reviewing some of the examples of compliance cases and how they have been, the enforcement has been interpreted against the fine schedule that we created, and whether we need to add more clarity there. Like that's the productive path for further work session I think we should embark on.
I mean, the IGA, doesn't it spell out revisited every 5 years or something? I don't remember when it was executed the last time. Might have been 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's
That
in
is
the,
not that is not the language of the IGA. That is the language of your strategic plan. When I checked in with the chair in our meeting, this body has not taken up those two components of its 5-year strategic plan that was both supported by the BOCC and City Council. So there has not been a constructive dialogue or feedback back to those two other governing bodies regarding any concerns in the IGA yet, and we welcome that.
Okay. I think the board should have input in, I mean, I can remember, Sarah, that when I was board president, I think I got asked for a performance review a day or two before the performance review was actually going to be given. I mean, I write 11 of them, and it takes me 6 to 7, 8 hours to write one, right? Because you give a lot of thought. I don't know, remember what I did last time with that, but it feels like the board president or somebody within the board should be a part of that process. Help set expectations, be a part of the review process.
And we can provide you the written comments submitted by the chair on behalf of the board back on October 4th, 2023, in conjunction with his last performance review. If that was not, the chair didn't share it
I
with
don't
the
necessarily
board.
need to see it. I just want them to be part of the process.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, I sit down with my team and I spend 3 hours walking through a performance review. How can you do better? Here's where I see you're doing great. man, your bank did a great job this year. But I mean, it's a big deal. And I look to improve them. I look to make them better. I look them to know my expectations of them, the bank's expectations of them. And to me, we have no input on that.
So I would again welcome a more constructive dialogue than what this time allows around that, because the board has, through the chair, provided input into that process. Myself or members of the city manager's office are not prohibiting any member of this board of meeting directly with Matthew to provide feedback and constructive conversation. So I struggle a little bit to hear that you feel like there's not those opportunities. Will we accept feedback for that performance evaluation? It includes, are there particular goal recommendations that might be coming from the board for the executive director as well? So I
mean,
just
we're not
encourage
perfect.
you
We
to
all have
fully
other
utilize.
jobs. But we can make.
So
And
hence
we
why
can be
it's my
involved.
responsibility to
did
ensure that happens.
Yeah, and I did provide comments last year. I was not consulted for the 2 prior years before that. So I fully expect to be a part of that for this year. Okay, well,
So can I summarize what I think
Sure.
I would propose as how to move forward? I would ask Sarah, when do you expect the third-party audit to come back?
I'm probably looking at 2 to 3 weeks based upon the workload of that individual who's doing it.
Okay, thank you. I think we should schedule a work session item on this. That would include the findings of the audit, would include staff's opportunity to digest and respond to your statement, to provide us with any detail about how they're currently implementing the compliance regulations and enforcement regulations, and a detailed review of the the notice of violation schedule, with, I think, examples that do not put us in a position of compromising any hearing officer and any appeals integrity, to understand, real examples of how staff has been enforcing our regulations as one item, and then perhaps further down the line to, in addition, further down in the future, to do the IGA review as a board, to actually dig in to the elements of it and provide the feedback as we committed to in our strategic plan.
yeah, and I think I would just add to that or maybe that's the work product that comes out of it, is the board providing specific expectations about, how we expect enforcement to be applied, which, again, I sort of expected to be consulted if there was a change. Okay. We will have this on a future agenda.
Both items, right?
What?
This compliance conversation, as well as the IGA review.
Correct,
For
yeah,
our strategic
yeah.
plan.
Okay, we will move on to continue discussion on affordability and rental rate study.
Thank you.
Drive safe, don't get a speeding ticket.
They're parked by the landfill and then by.
Can you let me?
No, they've got me before by the landfill.
Yeah, so the gravel.
I got a $170 ticket by the landfill.
And then by Lazy Glen.
Okay, sweet.
bear quorum.
We're all set. All right, so we're gonna move into an affordability follow-up and also talk about the upcoming rental rate and affordability study that the APCHA board and still has the opportunity to partner with the city of Aspen on. And we're bringing this back up again because we kind of brought it up in passing last time, I think just in executive director comments. So today we're really looking to get board's support either way, whether or not they'd like to expand that study to include the entire APCHA rental inventory, and versus if it's just the city of Aspen's, it would just be city of Aspen owned, which are APCHA managed. And we're also going to follow up on the previous affordability discussion the APCHA board had on March 20th, and just give a refresher on what was talked about there. We're going to focus in on category brackets, which is one of the prioritized topics, and give just a history of how the category brackets have changed over time and what initiated those changes and how those changes now have the category brackets where they sit today. And we're going to talk a bit about the 2016 policy study, since that was a source of a lot of those changes. And the goal of that discussion is just the data and thought necessary to make changes to those category brackets. So first, and Bethany's here too, and she's going to jump in to add whatever as needed, and she helped me pull all of this history together on the APCHA categories as well. So this is a refresher on all of the topics that the APCHA board brainstormed at that March 20th meeting. On the left side there is the definition of affordability, which I believe Kelly had pointed out is like the aspiration that we're looking for, which, yes, so affordability is relative. So when we're talking about affordability, it's are the sales prices, rental rates, category brackets properly aligned with the incomes and job portfolios of the APCHA inventory and owners and renters in Aspen. And so here's the 6 categories that we came up with, the APCHA board came up with, and the top 2 were the top prioritized. And so as I said earlier today, we're going to focus on category brackets just because all these are such big topics. And then we'll, at the end of this discussion, we also can talk about how the APCHA board sees the affordability discussions going in the future as well.
And it's really important as we go through to give the history of, it's really important as we go through to give the history of the category bracket so you can understand where we came from and why we are where we are now as we look to potentially make changes moving forward.
And some of you may be really familiar with how categories have changed over time, but it helps us see the full circle picture of where we're at, like Bethany said. So first, just a timeline of some of the biggest changes that have happened to the APCHA category brackets. So starting when APCHA was founded in 1982, categories, numbers weren't really a thing. It was just low, moderate, or middle. Corresponding with those, low would be like category 1, moderate, 2 and 3, middle, category 4. And then 1990, fully established, we have categories 1 through 4 in RO. And then I put 2003 in red just because this was incorrect in the memo, actually, and I found the right year that this changed. So 2003, APCHA expanded to categories 1 through 7 and RO. And categories 1, and then 5, 6, and 7 were added as a way to lessen the jump between category 4 and RO. So they were looking to, because they're seeing such a big drop off between the two, and decided to expand. And then 2016, 2017 is when we did the APCHA policy study, and those consultants actually recommended to consolidate categories 5 through 7. And I'll talk about the reasons behind that too, and some of the other big changes that came out of that study that greatly impacted the categories as well. And so you all are familiar with this. It's in our APCHA regulations. It has been for a while. So just also for the public as well, here's our current categories and the AMIs that they aim to serve. And so categories have expanded a lot since APCHA was originally started, just to meet the changing income needs of Aspen workers, so moving up to upper middle income. And the interesting thing about the AMIs that APCHA serves compared to other communities is just how much far-reaching it is as well. And to show sort of the unique state of our housing is
Getting people on the Front Range to understand 240% AMI and affordable housing is like an impossible conversation.
Yeah.
Like they're living in like the 80
Yeah,
to
of
100%
course.
world, you know?
Definitely. Yeah, and these AMIs were pretty close to what the 2016 policy study recommended as well. So, because that policy study, it used local workforce data, it used census data, they interviewed a lot of community members and staff. They also looked at other housing authorities across the country to really do a comprehensive overview of the APCHA inventory and our policies, regulations, and everything within. So the big changes that came out of this 2016 policy study, so as I mentioned earlier, eliminating categories 5 through 7, or consolidating, categories 5 through 7, and the big reason there is that they thought it was just a bit too complicated for the system and thought it'd be better to have a bigger bracket. Along with that, actually before that time, renters and owners were qualified through a different process. So there was different tables in the regulations for qualifying renters versus owners. So it wasn't just total household size. And the other really large change from that actually was switching to the use of AMI in APCHA categories as well. So that didn't happen until 2016. And prior to that, APCHA actually used 1999 data on incomes, and then every year would increase those incomes in the table by 3% or CPI, kind of like how we appreciate homes. And that was how they would adjust the incomes every year. And the consultant believed that AMI was just a more empirical method, widely used, a little less complicated, and it would just make more sense for the work we're doing. And so the point of this here is it's really hard to change the category brackets without having robust data and recommendations to make those from. So it's like if we know that there's some problems with the category brackets, but it's like, where should they be? Where we need data to back those decisions. And so that's why we're bringing up the rental rate and affordability study now, and it's great timing with all the work that the APCHA board is doing on affordability as well. And so I'm just going to go more in depth than we have in the past on the work that study is hoping to do, the benefits of APCHA's participation and partnership on that, and then we can talk about if the APCHA board is interested in that partnership and what different financial options there are for that and things like that. So the project goals here, so first and foremost, evaluate the affordability of APCHA and city-owned rental units. So kind of looking at brackets and incomes and everything in that realm. Looking at what suitable rental rates are for APCHA and city-owned units, providing recommendations that would impact our policies, so those would be brought to the APCHA board, and then also giving us some data that we can keep doing work from in the future too, so we can keep assessing affordability on our own too. So, and then I'll move into the scope of work, which similar to goals too. So what we're looking at having the consultant do, and this RFP is currently posted, I want to say, with the assumption that the entire APCHA inventory would be a part of it as well, but we are having them delineate in case that were not to happen as well. So so this would include just an overall data compiling of our property inventory and a full rental market analysis for Aspen. For APCHA managed, there'd be financial modeling for those units. And we'd be doing affordability analysis, which would include looking at category brackets and the incomes of renters as well, and incorporating that with what our current rental rates are. And then, of course, at the end, some reporting and final policy recommendations to make to both City Council and the APCHA board. So there are no questions, I'll just talk about what next steps would look like for both of these. So if the APCHA board is interested in partnering with the rental rate and affordability study, we can talk about, I can answer any questions about that, but also we could talk about how we would make that happen financially, since the city of Aspen has put into their budget on the 2024 budget for this already, but adding in all those units would definitely put it over that budget that's already allocated. And also, I want to say that this work would probably be completed by February 2025, just to give you a timeline, because I know getting this data impacts the rate of your affordability policy discussions you're already having. And so how that relates to the affordability discussion, up to the APCHA board as far as if you want to wait for having more of those discussions, if you're interested in this rental rate study RFP, or maybe giving some direction on where to take those affordability discussions next, whether you want to talk a little bit more about category brackets and what we can do outside of the data that we're waiting on, or maybe starting to talk about one of the other topics you brainstormed as well. So, yeah.
Can you send us this slide deck?
Yeah, of course.
I think if anybody has any thoughts, go ahead. We are missing half the board tonight, so probably need to get some input from the other 4 members who are not here.
Yeah, I think this is really important information for us to understand. We hear a lot of anecdotally about people paying way below what they can afford, or still being rent, burdened. So this will help sort of proof that, which I think is really crucial for our duties. I don't know what the financial partnership is. I'm happy to go to the BOCC and ask for their support. I would need more detail as to what that looks like. Francie and I are gonna go to our board. I think Matthew has been on a chain. I'm gonna shoot for June 18th, if that works. I didn't respond to that email yet, but I'm thinking that's better because it will also allow me to go over some regulation changes before second reading. So if there's information that you can provide to me about that before then, that would be super helpful to have. Yeah, I think it makes sense to segregate out, the city-owned units from the APCHA inventory, because one of the questions that immediately came to me is, what do we do in a situation where rent doesn't line up with maintenance? Where our goals for affordability might be in conflict with our duties to keep our buildings safe and healthy. So that will be more relevant, I think, for the city-owned properties to really have a clear picture on that than for the privately managed ones. But it also is helpful with those too. So I think that makes sense to disaggregate those. I do also wonder, it would be helpful for whoever does this study, to perhaps look to some of the work that the Housing Coalition has done, because they have done a bunch of work related to affordability too. So it might just help streamline data gathering on that. And those are my initial thoughts right now.
Okay, John, Francie?
I'd just say clearly this change in the categories seems to me obviously needs to be done. We had some information that I think City Council's seen several times where the lowest category 1 was paying up to 35% of their income on rent, and some category 4 owners were only spending 9%. So it's needs to be brought back into a level of equity.
Well, and I think that, right, obviously you can't set the category, but I do think that there is room for discussion around what you just mentioned.
Right.
Right, what is burdened?
Exactly.
And then within the categories, category 4, whatever it is, right? If it's
Expanded
30% at the bottom,
contracted.
or 30% at the top and 50% at the bottom, I mean, I think that's a conversation that can be had without the data, because once you get the data, then, right, you just multiply the percentages by the.
Yep.
Right, or, I mean, I think the data was gonna have expenses and have, right, so,
So you'd
correct
be
me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we're gonna look at other costs of living expenses into those calculations as well, but it sounds like to me you're interested in having a conversation as a board about more of like the affordability standard and what cost burden means as well, which that rental rate study will provide some insight as well, but I think it could also be helpful to have some conversation here about that as well.
Sorry if I missed it. Is this also gonna look at things like health insurance or anything like that, or childcare?
I believe in the RFP, we just wrote like other costs of living expenses, so I'm sure that'll be a conversation with the consultant too.
'Cause that's the kind of thing where like, you know, you're gonna pay the same health insurance premium at whatever salary you are, and that's gonna contribute to your affordability burden at lower ends than it would at upper ends. It helps explain the 35 versus the 9. That may be less of an extent for childcare just because of scholarship and aid and things like that. But I think I know our board would be interested in answering those questions and probably would want to know that this is a part of that. Okay, thanks.
I'd be curious.
Yeah, I would just add that I was going to say the same thing that John said, and I really appreciated him bringing that up, the affordability, and just the difference between people who are paying different percents. I would like us to at least look at that during this next study.
Thanks, Francie. Any other questions?
I think that gives us direction as far as we can bring it up again at a future APCHA board meeting, or we could also wait until the RFP closes too and just present it.
When is that expected?
We just extended it, and so I actually have to look at the exact date, but it's early June that it'll be closing. So.
Did you extend it because you didn't have enough applications?
No, so we extended before it closed, so I'm not sure exactly how many applications we were going to get, but there just was a few consultants at our pre-bid meeting that expressed interest in having a little more time to prepare for their bid, so we did it.
Okay.
Seems reasonable. Great.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Nothing else on the agenda.
Let's
Move to adjourn. You get to second things today.
I'll second.
And it's a roll call vote.
Carson,
Yes.
Kelly,
Yes.
John.
Yes.
Meeting is adjourned, 5:32.
Okay, thank you.